Hey, welcome back. Before we start this video, I want to thank you all for your support. I've been receiving a lot of love in the comments, and I have people even reaching out to me in LinkedIn. I just want to thank you all for the support, and I wish you nothing but the best to all of you. On the previous video, we expanded our application to include user authentication. Now we're able to create a new account and sign in and keep track of our expenses. On this video, we're going to expand our application to be able to sign in with Google. I hope you all enjoyed. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, and let's get started. Okay, so I want to show you this diagram to give you a better picture of how signing in with Google works. So we have a client, we have a web API, and we have Google. And we're going to read this from top to bottom. So let's say the user clicks in, sign in with Google. What happens? So the first thing we're going to do is make a request to Google, and we're going to get back an ID token among other things. You will see how this token looks like later. Then we're going to pass in this ID token along the request. And we're going to make a request to authentication/Google. This is a new endpoint we're going to create in our web API. Then we're going to verify that token, and we're going to be using Google's NuGet package for this. It's called google.apis.auth. If the token is valid, then we're going to create our own JWT, just like we have been creating them throughout this project, and send that as a response. And now that we have returned that token, that means the user will be signed in the front end, and every other subsequent request is going to be using that token we just created. Feel free to reference this diagram at any point throughout the video. I opened our expenses at front-end project in Visual Studio Code. Remember that the link to the repo is in the description below. And we're going to be starting by adding the npm package React Google login. This package makes it really easy to add a Google sign-in button. So let's go to our console and type npm install React Google login. Once that finishes, let's create a new component. So let's expand components, and in here we can right click and add a new file. Let's name it third party sign-ins.js. Let's import Google login. So we can do import Google login from React Google login, and we can do const third party sign-ins, and in here we can have a return, and let's have a div. Let's give it a little style. We can say text align center and margin top 1 REM. Then inside here we can have Google login. We can close it immediately. And this will have three things. We can have a client ID. More about that in a second. We'll have an on success. And we'll have on failure. The client ID, we get it once we register our app in Console Google Cloud. So let's go ahead and jump to that first. Any application that uses Auth 2.0 to access Google APIs must have authorization credentials. In the following steps, we'll create credentials for a project, and once we have those credentials, we can access the APIs. Let's go ahead and navigate to console.cloud.google.com/apis/credentials. Once you have logged in, click on Create Credentials, and let's click on Auth Client ID. And in here, it will say to create an Auth Client ID, you must first set a production name on the consent screen. So let's click on this. Right here, we have two options. Let's go with the external. And this will include adding a list of test users. And let's click create. Let's go ahead and give it a name. So we can say expenses, user support email. I'm gonna use my email. We can add a logo if we want. We can skip this for now. And let's add our developer email. And click save and continue. In our case, we're only getting the user's email, picture, and name. But if you'd like to get more specific types of private user data, this is the place to set it up. With that said, let's go ahead and save and continue. Now this is where we add our test users accounts. So only users that are registered here can actually use our app. So let's use my email. And click add. And let's click on save and continue. So we can quickly review this. And let's just go back to dashboard. Let's go ahead now and click on credentials. Click on create credentials, Auth client ID. And let's pick web application. Let's give it a name. I'll say expenses. Now we will need to come back and add a URI here. But for now, so that you see what happens if you don't, let's just click create. And let's copy this, your client ID. This is what we're going to be using. We are not going to be needing the client secret. So let's copy this. Now back at our code, let's open .env. And in here we can say React app client ID. And we can set it equal to what we just copied from. Let's save that. Let's head back to third-party sign-in. We can now set our client ID to process that environment or env that React app client ID. Now on success, we want to make a call to our backend, and we're going to pass the token ID that is coming from part of the response. So let's go ahead and open services and let's open authentication. Now in here, let's create a new function. So we can say export const third party sign in. This will be asynchronous. We're going to pass a dispatch and a token. And here we'll have a try and a catch. And we can say just console.log. We can say error. Inside the try, we'll have our API call. And we're going to get the response. So let's do const data. And we'll set that equal to await Axios instance. That post. And then we haven't created this endpoint yet, but let's just call it Google. And then we're going to have a parameter, a query parameter. So we just say token equal to token, and we're going to pass our token. And lastly, we're going to dispatch user authenticated, and we pass in data, just like we did for the previous ones. Let's save this and head back to our component. And in here, then we can get the response, and then we can say third party sign in, and we can pass in dispatch, and we can pass the token ID that is inside that object. For that, we'll need to import a couple of things. So we need to import third party sign in from. Let's go back and we'll go to services, and in here we want authentication. And we also want to import use dispatch from React Redux. That means that in here we'll have to do const dispatch use dispatch. We're using that hook, and we're passing it right here. Cool. Last thing will be on failure, and for that we can just do a console log at the moment, and let's just say error, and let's just put the E. Let me delete this new line, and at the bottom we can say export default third party sign-ins and save this file. So right now we have this component set up with our Google login. We have the client ID, we have the third party sign in, and we pass in the token ID, which this is just a JWT, and we have this set up already, right? And if we want to add a new one in the future, we can just add Facebook or any other one inside this div right here. Let's go ahead now and add this component to our signup page and our sign-in page. So we can go to sign up first, and let's do an import. We can say import third party sign-ins from third party sign-ins. I'm actually gonna copy this for the sign-in later. And let's scroll down, and right here after form, we can say third party sign-ins. Okay, save this file. Now let's go to sign-in page, and we can just paste that in here and do the same thing. So at the bottom, we can just do third party sign-ins and save this. Now, if we open our application, we're gonna see a sign in with Google. And if we click on it, we're gonna have an authorization error. And it says redirect URL mismatch. And if you keep reading, you're gonna see that localhost 3000, which is our URL currently, it says do not match the ones authorized for the Auth client. And it says to visit this URL. And this is the error I was mentioning to you before when we were registering our app. So let's go back to Google Console Cloud and fix this. So now that we're here, let's close this and let's click on edit. And in here, we can just say authorize JavaScript origins, and we can click on add URI. We can add the one from our local host 3000, which is the port that I am currently running my front-end application. Don't forget to save it, and now we are ready. So let's go back to our app. Back at our app, we can click on sign in with Google, and now you should see this screen, and we can see that it says continue to expenses. And if we click on it, we can even see the email that I used. If you're still having issues after that, one thing you can do is if you have the DevTools open, you can right click here and do empty cache and hard reload. Now, if I click on sign in with Google, it's going to automatically sign in for me because I only have a single Google account and I already signed in with it. So I'm going to click on it and it's going to automatically try to sign in. And now we're going to get an error. And this error is due to the fact that we haven't created this endpoint yet, /Google doesn't exist in our backend. But we do have a token here. This means that we did get a response from Google. So this is really good news. So let's head over to network and we can try to sign in again. And right here, we can see that we have this request and this request was actually successful. And we have multiple things here, but we really only care about this ID token. So let's try to copy this whole value. We can right click on it and click on copy value. And let's head over to jwt.io. In here, we can paste the token we have and see what is inside of it. So we can see that is issued by accounts@google.com. And my email is this. The email is verified and it has my name, picture, given name and family name. And one important thing that it has, of course, is the subject. And the subject is what uniquely identifies a user. This is why this should be your key in the database. If you're ever storing any data of the user, this is the key you want to have, not the email. The email can change, so a user can change his or her email at any time. So you shouldn't be using emails as the key. You should be using this subject ID. So very, very important. So remember this. All right, so now that we have the token, let's go ahead and open up our Expenses.web API application. And let's add the new endpoint. So let's go to controllers and open up authentication controller. Under here, let's say it's an HTTP post. Let's name it Google. Let's say public async task action result. And let's name it Google sign in. And in here, let's do it from query. And let's get a string token. So we're basically getting the token. And the first thing we gotta do is validate that token. And for that, we're gonna be using google.apis.auth NuGet package. So let's go ahead and install that. Let's right click on Expenses.web API. And let's go over to manage NuGet packages. In here, let's go to browse. And let's type in google.apis.auth. There you go. Let's get this one and let's click on install. That's it, back to our controller. Accept. Let's go ahead and write payload, var payload equals to await. We'll do validate async. And we're going to be passing the token and a new validation settings. And make sure we're using static google.apis.auth.google JSON web signature. In here, we're going to pass in our client ID as the audience in order to make sure that the token that we're getting is for our application. So let's do audience equal to new, and this will be an array. And in here, we can do environment. And let's make sure we're using system that get environment variable. And then I'll call it client ID. Okay. And let's go over to our properties and open up launch settings. In here, let's add our client ID. So we can say client ID, and I'll add mine. Make sure you add yours. And I'll copy and paste this in here. This way we have our client ID. Okay, let's save this file and head back to our controller. Now, if the token is valid, that means that we can get some information out of it. In our case, we're only going to get the email and the subject, since the subject is what makes the user unique. And we're going to pass in this information to a new method that we're about to create in Expenses.core project. Let's go ahead and open our core project and let's click on iUser service. And in here, we're going to create a new method, say task. We'll say authenticated user. And we can say external sign in. And we're going to pass a user. Let's go ahead now and open our user service and make sure we are implementing this interface. There you go. And if we go to our user, we can see that right now what we have is an ID, a username, password, and an email. But in order to support our external sign-in, we need to add a external ID, and this will be for the subject. This is the subject that we get on the token. This is what we are going to store in this external ID. And also we're going to have a external type. In our case, this will be Google, but say you have Facebook, this could be Google or Facebook, whichever sign-in method you're using. So what this means to us is if there's a matching external ID in our database, then this user already has an account and we just send them in. If not, then we store this new ID and essentially this would be a signup. Let's go ahead and write public string external ID. In the case of Google, this would be the subject field. And then let's do a public string external type get set. Let's save this file, and actually let's save all the files. Let's make sure our application builds. So let's go back to the controller, and let's just do a return. Let's say created, and we can just do some empty strings. And let's save this and try to build this application. Now that we know that our application builds, let's create a migration to add our external ID and external type to our schema. Let's go ahead and open Package Manager console, and we can do add migration. We can call it add external sign in. Let's change the default project to Expenses.DB. Let's hit enter. And right now we see that the external ID column got created and the external tab as well. This looks good to me. Let's now do update database. Hit enter. And it succeeded. And if we go to SQL Server Object Explorer and we refresh all of this and open our databases again and open Expenses.DB and tables, and let's view the data of user, we can see that now we have ID, username, password, email, external ID, and external type. Let's head back now to user service and implement the external sign-in method. Now, the first thing we want to check in here is to see if the user coming in already exists in our database, whether we already have that external ID and external type. So let's start by typing var db user equal to await context that users. And here, let's do first or default. And we can do u. And we can do u.external ID equals to our user.external ID. And u.external type that equals to external to user.external type. Let's go ahead and mark this method async. There you go. Now, if DB user is null, this means that the user doesn't already have an account. So we have to create an account for this user and create a username. So we can do user.username equal to create unique username from email. And we can pass in the user.email. Let's go ahead and create this method. I'm going to copy this. Scroll the way down. And let's paste it in here. We're going to pass an email. And this is going to be a private and return a string. Let's do something simple here. We can do var email split equal to email that split. And let's do this and then just get the first part. Okay. Let's make sure we are using system.link. So now that we have the first part, let's do a random. So we can just attach a random number to the end, random, and let's do the var username equal to email split. And now while context that users that any, and I'll explain in a second what we're doing here. Username that equals to the username. we want to be looping, and username will be equal to email split plus random dot next, and let's add some number here. I added about 9 zeros. So that should do it, and then let's just return username at the end. So let's do a quick recap. The first thing we do is to a split at the @ sign. We get the first part of that. Then we assign a username to be the email split. And if there's something that matches our username that we generate, then we just add a random number, and we're going to continue to do that until we have a unique username. Then finally, we're just going to return the username. Let's go up to our method. Okay. So now that we have the username, all we got to do really is return, await, and call our signup method. And let's pass in user. So if we want to reuse the signup method, we got to remind ourselves that the signup method hashes our password. And in this case, a user doesn't have a password, right? So let's go to the signup method, and let's make sure that we only hash that password if there is a password. So up here, we can wrap it in an if statement and say if string that is null or empty, then do this. Meaning if it's not null or empty, hash a password. Else, don't do it. If you try to do this and password is null, you're gonna get an exception. Okay, and just to be safe, let's head over to the sign-in method, and let's add here that if db user that password is null, then we can say invalid username and password. Meaning since the user never created a password, he or she needs to sign in using Google account. Now let's finish writing our method. So right here, so if the user is null, we create an account for the user. Else, the user already has an account. We just do a new authenticated user. And we say the username equal to db user.username, and the token equal to a JWT generator that generate auth token, and we pass the db user.username. Okay, semicolon. Let me save this file. Let's now head back to our authentication controller and let's wrap this up. So what we're missing here would be do a var result equal to await, and let's call user service, and let's call external sign in, and let's pass in a new user, and this will have an email that payload email equal payload that email external ID be equal to payload that subject, and external type be equal to Google. Okay, semicolon here, and then we can say return created, and then return the result. Save this file, and let's go ahead and try to run our application. And now that we have running our web API and our front-end application, we can go ahead and click on sign in with Google. And it's loading up, and there you go. I'm signed in. Let's go ahead and check our database and see what information is in there. So if we now look at the database, we can see that a new user was generated with the username, password is null, the email, and the external ID and external type. And now if we go back to the app, everything should be working as expected. If we do 5 and we add that, it's added. And then if I log out and I try to sign in again, we get the 5 right here. So everything looks good. And with this, we have reached the end of this video. I hope you find that helpful. If you did, please hit the like button, comment below and subscribe if you haven't already. Keep working towards your goals, and I'll see you all in the next one.